Today we're going to talk about the middle madu. The middle madu is a combination of a small shield and Florentine in both function and style. It provides the protection of a small shield plus some additional from the spikes, plus a limited version of the threat provided by two swords. Middle madu doesn't provide the full defense of a medium shield or the full threat of Florentine. If offense and defense capabilities were a spectrum, it would exist between these two styles. This is one of the nuanced advantages, as this middle ground occupies an interesting and unpredictable place in fighting that you can play with and live in both worlds. That sounds very robotic. All right. You can live by your dominant hand sword like a board user, or you can overwhelm people like a Florentine person, depending on what the needs of the moment are.
Do we want to give some examples of this as we're going along too?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
Let's see, examples of that. So fighting, yeah, this makes me feel less corporate when I'm doing it.
Yeah.
So fighting with a middle madu, you can fight like it's a punch shield and do things like this, that kind of stuff. And you also have a limited version of Florentine, so I can really feint here and come in. I almost tripped, and that probably would have hurt a lot. I can really feint here, come in with this gut stab, or once they're kind of afraid of it, because everybody's afraid of it, threaten, they take the shot, or I take the shot here, or I hit them with the charge. So, in summation, it's basically, you have some Florentine options, you have a punch shield, and it's kind of the middle ground between both of them.
Now, one of the things to watch out for is that it sits in the middle ground. It's not a perfect middle ground, so the weaknesses of both styles are kind of there too, where this is very similar to, but not identical to, like a small punch shield. And in the similarities are that you tend to need to overcommit to a block. There's no soft shrug into a block. You really have to get that block in front of it, which means middle madus are a lot more vulnerable than like a medium-sized strap shield to things like coming up over the top and then wrapping down below, or going here. The big fakes into smaller shots are a lot more vulnerable, and you will also have to watch out for that elbow because it will not be passively guarded basically no matter what you do. The other imperfection to it is that you have to get a lot closer for the Florentine style to match or to start to come into play, which means that if I'm fighting a madu fighter, there's really two modes that they're going to have to be in. It's turtle and play the ranged out game of a small shield, or the overwhelming aggression and flurry of a flow fighter. But you don't get to switch easily back and forth between the two. It's kind of a jarring transition. So if I'm fighting against a madu fighter, I'm going to be trying to get them to switch into an aggressive mode, and then I'm going to try to disengage, and they have to recognize that I'm disengaging and stop, or press forward and hope that they've got enough of an advantage that they can carry the day. But these are the sorts of things that a madu fighter will have to watch out for, is their opponent baiting different actions out of them, because you kind of have to commit to an action at 100% as a madu fighter, or else you're just not getting ground out of it.
So what do you do with the madu? All right, first thing, the top spike is probably the part that you use the most in terms of striking. It's obviously to the ribs here. You can also go outside like this, or you can do some kind of over thing like that. The top spike is also very defensive. So if I'm throwing on my shoulder, I can use that top spike as an extra few inches on my shield to block it out. The bottom spike is less used. Bottom spike, look like this. Oh, yeah. If I'm fighting a lefty, I might tie him up here, bottom spike him in the chest. I might come over the top with the bottom spike. It's a lot more of a defensive piece on the madu, so it's going to guard those legs and just be able to, I can get a little bit lower without having to go to the ground.
Yeah, I mean, when I see a bottom spike come into play, a lot of times if I throw for a thigh, it's passively blocked, unlike most shields. And if I throw a hip wrap, you actually have a little bit of play where you can like push out and get away with getting that sword out of the way by actively clearing. But you kind of have to be aggressive to get any mileage out of that, because just pushing away with it isn't going to do a whole lot unless you're closing in for a kill, which allows you to push out and then hook a stab in. Yeah, I mean, the bottom spike is, in my experience, largely decoration.
Yeah. It's not super important. The top spike is where a lot of it is. Something else you can do with the top spike, if we're fighting in a line battle and you're harassing my opponent over here, I can tie up his sword and go for a high cross by keeping this in this joint right here. So there's a lot of strength right here to keep the sword tied up. As far as styles, sword and middle madu is strongest against a righty sword and board setup. So because I have this lane of attack right here, there's a lot of threat here.
Let's adjust slightly so you can see that lane of attack a little more clearly.
I have lanes of attack right here, under, over this side. I also have sword, here. I also have sword, here. I have lots of angles of attack, so it's strongest against this style. Flip it against a lefty sword and border.
We're gonna try this.
Madu is actually weakest because it's a traditional matchup here, but I have this Madu that really doesn't do much of anything. I mean, I can occasionally tie up to stab over the top. These are very low percentage shots, and it's only if the lefty is not expecting it or those going to land. So it's basically just a punch shield matchup against a lefty, and that's usually not great because lefties that we know tend to be pretty explosive.
Yeah. Now one of the things you had this in the write-up for the class originally that we had done is talking about people will expect this sort of thing. Is that it's really not a particularly common style, which gives you a lot of mileage, particularly against cross gamers. Was one of the points you had brought up. In that against a cross gamer, very few games outside of Amtgard allow a shield and weapon combination. Amtgard is almost unique, if not unique in that aspect, which makes it very, very dangerous against those sorts of fighters.
They just don't expect it. So when you stab, like you'll hear this all the time, like, oh, I wasn't paying attention to that. So that's one advantage of it. The second is when they really focus on this fight, you get them 1 or 2 times with it, they're going to be watching that like a hawk. Yeah. You get them 1 or 2 times with it, they're going to be watching this like a hawk and threaten it, and they're wide open on this side. You know, it becomes kind of a scary chess piece to use.
One of the things I've seen you do is go in and you'll fake sword side with your sword, and then fake to shield side with the sword. At that point, they're like, oh, okay, so they track the first one. Oh, that was a fake, and then a lot of times they'll overcommit to that one and open up for it. That's what I see you get a lot of mileage off of when you're needing to blitz someone down and go down the line in a ditch. That's a typical very quick way of getting a kill, so long as the opponent is either sufficiently blocked out or sufficiently worried about throwing a shot at you to pull that off. But yeah, like using the sword in combination to open up where you throw a fake into a second fake with the sword is really not a bad way of getting people to move equipment out of the way, especially if they have you mentally tagged as a sword and border. So yeah, that is just something that
they love this. Once they're afraid of the top spike, they love the big feint here because they go for the shot. You can either pull it back in a block, or you can block over with your sword here. But pulling it back, they're just wide open for a counterattack here. And it just, as they start getting afraid, they want to stop it, so they throw at your shoulder. And you want them to. That's where you want them to throw.
Yeah.
Against Florentine,
let me grab another sword. I'm going to circle behind, belly back.
Florentine, it's not especially effective, and this is really one of the biggest downsides of Madu, is that it's really good against righty sword and board, and it's less than 50% against everything else. Florentine, I would say that, like I said, about 40 to 45% in terms of
equal skill level.
Yeah, a matchup. I'm gonna be at a deficit because we're essentially both Florentine, but he's got reach on his left hand.
Yeah,
and I don't.
You have a larger passive block and a shorter reach off of your left hand, and also without the ability to slash with your left hand is definitely a limiting factor. Yep. So really, you're fighting very similarly to a small punch shield and a short sword versus Florentine, which is usually not a place that you really want to be in unless you specialize in that sort of thing.
It's not the worst. I mean, it's fine and it's doable, and I won't avoid Florentine matchups, but it's not preferred. It's not your bread and butter. Pole arm, it's like a small shield plus
a little
5%.
Bit of extra
yeah, plus 5-10%, which is not a great matchup either. It's not great against pole arm. It's not great against sword and down spear. It's just anything with reach is going to have an easier time picking you apart because of your active defense that's required.
And the fact that really to get mileage, you are going to have to aggress. I mean, if there's one, I feel like if there's one takeaway from a madu class, it's aggress the person.
Yes, you have to play aggressively. You just have to. Let's see. I'm trying to think. There was one other thing I just lost.
I know you talked about class gaming with the
Yes.
ability to. Is that what you're going to for?
Yes. Oh, I was going to say sword. Longsword in madu is actually surprisingly okay too. It's going to neutralize some of the advantage. So longsword versus Florentine, I feel like is actually maybe 55-60% because I can utilize that longsword and stay at range. And the one downside to longsword is if they charge in, it's not viable, but I still have a weapon.
Yeah.
And I feel like just the longsword, using a longsword against two shorts on Florentine, it nets you enough extra points that becomes a favorable matchup.
I feel like at that point, the flow fighter really has to concentrate on one piece of equipment.
Yes.
And it's very, very difficult to not get gigged by the other piece of equipment.
Yes, exactly.
When you fight to that style.
It changes the script. All of a sudden, I have the reach advantage. You have to close, and I have something if you close.
Yeah.
If you're closing and I guess right,
a larger passive block and the ability to counter swing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But then it becomes a disadvantageous matchup against righty swordboard.
Yeah.
Because all of a sudden the righty swordboard can close on you with impunity because you lost a lot of your offense here because they can block it out. You still have something, but it's not a favorable matchup because longsword and shield is not favorable against sword and shield, I think. Pole arm, it doesn't change. Lefty swordboard is longsword and madu is awful. You're done. You're finished with that because you lose everything that you had over here, and this was everything in that matchup. Class gaming, madu is surprisingly effective in a class game because one of the strongest things that you need to have in a class game, if you have the capability of doing it, is blocking arrows. I feel that being able to block arrows in a class game is really, really important. And so a madu gives you the opportunity to have two threats, two weapons, yet still be able to block arrows. So I feel like it gains some points in class games.
Yeah. Now the disadvantage of that is twofold. One is that crushing breaking weapons can neutralize your left-handed offensive weapon relatively quickly. The additional part is that if a wizard heats your madu, you now no longer are able to use the shield portion. And even worse, if they heat your short sword, you're stuck with a madu. And that is one of life's greatest pleasures, is watching someone try to fight with just a madu.
It's not. I would take sword and medium or long sword and medium in any kind of situation where you're in the tight corners, like a bridge, a castle battle. The madu is not going to give you the mileage the sword and shield will, just because you're going to be blocking pole arms all day, and that sword and shield and medium is going to be better at that. A field battle, I think sword and madu is going to outdo sword and medium shield. Because the arrows can be blocked, and pole arms are not a concern, and so you just have that extra attack.
Now, the one thing that I will say, I think that the biggest drawback for madus in open field battles is that because you're borderline required to aggress, I think a madu is one of the worst styles for one-on-many.
Yes.
Specifically.
Yes.
Because
I would have a long sword in the open field battles.
Which I understand, but to the broader point of the madu, I do think that the madus are really good at overwhelming one opponent.
Yes.
And if there's multiple opponents, you have to do about 19 different things right to survive doing what you want to do the first time.
I agree with that.
And it becomes very, very difficult because you have to, with a small block, you have to block your arms and your legs to close, or you have to fight from a distance against multiple opponents with a smaller passive block.
I agree.
So that is just one of the things that, like, try not to let yourself get isolated against multiple opponents, or else you're going to have a very difficult time. It's doable. Everything's doable, but it's much more difficult to do what you want to do with a madu than it is with a sword and shield, or really any other combination that lets you kind of play at different ranges. Because madu is just so much of it is you want to aggress, and aggressing a group of people with small passive blocks is just kind of a bad recipe for success.
Yeah. I think where it shines is if you're in a tank buster role of some kind. So like if you have like 3 points of armor or something like that, and you're going against full plate sword board, take the shot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You can just land shots, and you're going to land twice the shots they are, all things being equal, because you can just sit there and Florentine on them essentially, and they have one sword.
And a lot of times they'll start throwing bigger outside shots that you can either tank on your armor or throw that block up and continue.
I'm in, and I just go. but you know, Florentine's going to do better in that role. But with Florentine, you don't have the arrow block. You know, so again, once again, it fits that middle ground.
Yeah, and getting to that position with Florentine is harder because again, the smaller passive block. If you have a Madu and you're against a tanked out sword and board, they throw a couple of shots, you're blocking and closing. With Florentine, that's usually a lower percentage because the odds of you missing a block going in is a lot higher. I mean, of course, a couple of points of armor here and there can change that math pretty quickly. But if you're wanting to maintain the armor that you've got, Madu is not a bad way of going about it.
Scouts can use it. That helps. Anything that's small shield, it counts as a small shield, so that helps a lot.
Yeah, druids can use it. Yep. Healers can use it. Yep. Small shield and short weapon.
Let's see. I had one more thing I forgot. Pull out the notes. We're pulling out the notes to finish this up.
We had gone back and forth a couple of times.
I started with the notes that sounded cool.
Right.
Let's see. What do we got?
Oh, don't hurt people.
Yes, that's actually what I was trying to think of.
Yep.
Ironically, that's funny. Yes. So you watch some older videos about Sword and Madu, and you hear things about like you can make them make the noise and all that kind of stuff. Don't do that, please. These things can hurt. They're not. They can be unfriendly, especially if you're trying to make it unfriendly. Like, don't hurt your friends. That's not cool.
Once you're inside, you don't need to power through that stab. A stab is a stab is a stab.
Yeah.
As far as Amtgard is.
It's not necessary. The one time it's actually, works to your advantage is if somebody is wearing plate, they're going to feel that. They're going to feel that through the plate. So think about it. If they're going to feel that through the plate, you really don't need to stab with it regularly very hard. Real light, that's fine. That's it. That's all I got.
So I did want to say, if you are on a field and you are having trouble with a Madu fighter, the things that I would suggest that you do are learn effective shots against people who are closing on you. That a lot of times those are the shots that are going to land on Madu fighters. And we'll go through a couple of them. I mean, of course, this will give me boos from a couple of different kingdoms, but easiest one, a very effective way of neutralizing a Madu fighter is to take the leg. As soon as the leg is gone, their ability to aggress you is gone, and they're now a small shield fighter. The odds of you landing a stab with a Madu when you're legged are really, really low, and they're generally like ditch stopping moments of like, oh my god, it worked.
That actually happened.
So a couple of things you're going to want to do. A lot of times I find that I get mileage out of like big outside wraps over here. Now you are a very, very good Madu fighter, so I don't land this on you a ton, but against a lot of people I have a lot of success with coming down like this and throwing up and over, just because this section here, like I said, with the elbow, there's no passive block. Between the elbow and the shoulder, you have to actively move into a blocking position there. So the more fake that I put in, the harder wrap that I throw over there, the more likely that is. Because of the Madu fighter's tendency to close, I find that they are almost as vulnerable to stabs as Florentine fighters are. If I have my sword set up here, a lot of times the Madu fighter is going to try to rush and push past, at which point I can hook a stab out. They're pushing the same direction that I'm pushing, and the tip goes in.
That's how you do that.
That is 100% how I do that.
I'm like, stab land every time.
That's what I've developed over the past year or so, and I've used fairly liberally. Now Charlie knows why. Tanath knows why. But so that's one that you'll get some mileage out of. And then another one that I actually throw against you relatively frequently is I'll choke up and I'll come in and I'll throw high. Which again, the tendency to overcommit to a block means that I can start to throw high and then go into a wrap there. Now this requires relatively fast hand speed, but a lot of times a Madu fighter, especially if they're closing, is going to have the Madu out. And when they have the Madu out and you start to wrap high, they bring it in and tight. And that leaves a great spot here because they want to keep their Madu in play so that if they catch that first block, they can come out of it. Right?
I'm going to rotate like this, which is going to open me wide open.
Mm-hmm. So against like a small shield fighter, this would not necessarily be as effective of a fake, but against a Madu fighter, because they're wanting to keep this top spike in play, it's a lot more effective to high and low it like that. Now for that one, you're going to want to choke up because range doesn't matter, hand speed matters. Other than that, sometimes you can get someone to extend into a stab with the madu, and if you can fade back, that shoulder's incredibly open.
Yep.
It's risky because if you misjudge that, you're getting stabbed in the ribs.
Yep.
But it's not necessarily a bad way of going about it. If you can get them to commit to a stab at a little bit too long of range, then there's just no defense there. They've just extended the only passive bit of defense they have out to attack you, and that attack missed. So that is something to consider. But other than that, I mean, and these are all attacks I can do with a right sword, because of course there's all this stuff with Florentine, but you're largely looking at the shots that work against flow fighters and the shots that work against small punch shield fighters are the sorts of shots you're going to try to use on Madu. And we've gone through a couple of them, and again, just don't be afraid to take legs. With the same way that a Madu fighter is going to have difficulty fighting against multiple opponents, if you leg the Madu fighter, they're going to have a much more difficult time doing anything that it is they want to do. They can only do their distance fighting, but you know, the disadvantage we really haven't gone over with the Madu is that it's like a small shield, but it weighs more. It is slightly slower to pull around from one block into another block. So if you have a very, very strong...
And it can get caught up on things.
It can get caught up on stuff.
You be going for that block and catch it, and you're like, uh-oh, you're done.
But I mean, honestly, you have a very, very good active defense, which is one of, I think, the best reasons, one of the biggest reasons you're such an effective Madu fighter, is that even with as small of equipment as you have, it's difficult to land shots, and it's difficult to stop you from doing what you're wanting to do. I mean, that is I think, overwhelmingly where you get your success from, and where you get your reputation as a Madu fighter from, is that it's very, very difficult to stop you from getting this far away, and me going like, okay, I've got to block like 9 things, and I have 2 things to block with, and I don't like this situation at all.
It's you're gonna have to to use this. People that I see so many people, hey, can you borrow your Madu? And they get out there and they're just so excited about throwing that stab, and they get super aggressive, and they just lose.
And that's where the like, I'll come in and aggressive, like, oh yes, my time has come, and they'll throw the Madu stab and just miss. Yeah, like against an inexperienced Madu fighter is almost a free kill.
Yes.
Because of the fact that aggression is important, but it has to be paired with a very, very solid active defense.
It's the swarm boxer.
The swarm boxer.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bob, for blasphemy for this moment.
You gotta have a tough chin. You gotta be able to block stuff. And get in there.
The only example of a tough chin that actually is takeable, it can be taken away from this. So I'm through with the things that I had wanted to say. Do you have anything more that you wanted to add?
No, use this. Don't use this a lot. It's like 20% of the time you're stabbing with it. If you're using it like more than 50% of the time, you're overusing it, and you're not going to get anywhere with it.
So did you, the people who are here, since we have you, did you have any questions that we can help answer?
Shield crushing with my pole.
What?
Shield crushing with my pole.
Yeah,
yeah.
Yes, that works.
We talked about that a little bit before you came over here. Yeah, shield crushing with a pole is a good way of neutralizing a Madu fighter.
I didn't know
making someone go from a Madu to a single short is never a bad thing. Again, making them go from short sword Madu to a single Madu is even funnier.
Yeah, that's terrible.
But yeah.
I got one more thing.
Okay.
One more thing. Your block strike drills work with this. So like if they throw high, you're like to the outside, boom, just block strike drill, boom, block in. You can absolutely use that muscle memory and crush with this thing by just block striking with it.
Just don't crush too hard.
Yes, but I mean they don't
Right.
expect that level of speed on a return. Just block strike, and it works. So I mean it's doable.
The one thing I would say for less experienced fighters is, while you can absolutely use that, make sure you don't slash with it.
Yes.
Because you will get caught out absolutely into, you block over here and then you slash for the forearm or something like that, and then either your opponent will point out or you are forced to admit that that's not a legal shot from your equipment. There are slash legal Madus. I've seen them. I'm not an advocate of them, but they are kind of funny sometimes.
It's too bulky.
Too bulky, yes. So that's about it. I am Bighead. This is Tanath, and hopefully you get something out of it.
Yeah. All right. Good.